All right. Do you have a notification?
Well, where's the notification, Youri? Yes, I see that. You're recording the call. Yeah, well,
Okay, perfect.
let's take up this
Okay,
question again then.
yeah, all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. We are joined by Nick Beam, Nick Beam, who is a member of the Socialist Equality Party, their branch in Australia, and a contributor to the World Socialist website, mainly focusing on Australian topics. And yes, on this edition of One Plus One, we're going to be talking about all things Australia, and I've been wanting to do a topic on Australia for a long time. Did get the chance to do it with Robert and Selena Eggington, but now with Nick Beam, we're going to talk about all things Australia, how the working class is faring under coronavirus, under the ongoing coronavirus crisis. We're going to be talking about the neoliberal age, or as I prefer to call it, the neo-Dickensian age of Australia. But but before we get into that, so Nick, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah. Well, just to make a point at the start, we may be talking about things Australian, but I want to emphasise at the start that nothing in Australia or any other country can be understood outside of the global context. That is, as Trotsky once said, every national economy or country is an original combination of the basic features of the world process. And that's how I think we have to understand the settlement of Australia. It's often portrayed that Australia was settled as a penal colony. They wanted to get rid of prisoners. No, it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't. What happened was that Australia was settled as a trading post, as a naval post, under conditions where the British Empire and trade was expanding. The Pacific had just been opened up, particularly by Cook's voyages, which embodied James Cook, 1770 and subsequently, which embodied a remarkable breakthrough in navigation. Accurate longitude was now discovered. You could actually pinpoint where you were. Before that, it was very difficult. So this opened up a whole new area of the world. If you look at a map, I mean, the Pacific is about 2/5 of the world's surface. It's a huge area. So it was a trading post. It was a naval post. And sailing ships require regular replenishment, fresh water, fresh meat, fresh food. They're very small. They can't carry a lot. And we tend to forget those things when we consider the situation from our present standpoint. But they're very important. And China, the trade to China was particularly important. The routes to China were significant. You might recall Lewis and Clark, the famous explorers of the United States, were commissioned a few years later by Jefferson to explore America, but also to discover whether there was a passage through America to China. China was a big factor in the expansion of Europe and how to get there. Anyway, the other factor that was very important in establishing a trading post, a naval post here, was whaling, which was extremely important. Don't forget, there's no oil. Whale oil lights the factories which are starting to develop. Whale oil is a very big industry. And of course, Australia right from the outset was involved in that. Now, why was it a penal colony? Because you couldn't establish it any other way. You had to use forced labour. And don't forget, this forced labour was nothing out of the ordinary. It was characteristic of the beginning of industrial capitalism. If you go to Britain at the latter part of the 18th century, the terms prison, factory, workhouse are virtually interchangeable. They're the same thing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't the overcrowding of the British jails and so on that led to the surplus of convicts being sent to Australia. If you look at it, I mean, that's nonsense. For the cost of sending out a fleet to Australia, they could have built a big prison on the Salisbury Plains if they're prisons. That didn't happen. Or they could have sent the convicts to the West Indies. They could have sent, But it wasn't. They wanted to open up a base for trading, and that led to, from a trading post, to the development of capitalism in Australia. That's another story, but that's what I think it's important to get the starting point right. So Australia was a product, the settlement was a product of global processes, and above all, the expansion of global commerce. So that's the starting point.
Because my first question to you was if you can describe briefly, if possible, how Australia was founded as a penal colony and the brutal conditions that the poor British, Irish, Welsh, and Scots were transported to Australia for much of it because of the very punitive punishments of the Victorian Dickensian period in England.
Well, it was before Victoria. It was before Victoria. I mean, we're talking about the late 18th century, right? Okay. We're talking about 1788. And why there were so many penalties was because this was industrial capitalism was developing. You've got to understand this is an enormous change, an epoch-making change in life. No one wants to go into what Blake called the dark satanic mills. So the state has to really force that development. So there are all sorts of laws against being a vagabond. There are all sorts of criminal proceedings about anybody who tries to avoid service to the rising capitalist class in the factories. You impose harsh penalties for stealing a loaf of bread, for stealing a handkerchief, for doing all these things. Why? The criminal system and the punitive measures, I think they had at least dozens, if not hundreds, of offences which are punishable by capital punishment or transportation. It's to force labour into the factories, and that was very difficult. Nobody wanted to go and do that. They had a different way of life. You didn't turn up at 5 o'clock. You didn't turn up to the impoverished conditions of the factories. This was a complete brutal change. So the brutality in Britain, brutality in Australia, the forced condition, and they were horrific in some of the instances.
Can you talk about some of the brutal conditions? That the working class faced in Britain, and in Ireland when they were sent over to Australia, the conditions on the ships, and some of the conditions that they were met when they arrived to yours truly, Australia.
Well, in some instances, one of the best instances, of course, is Frederick Engels' great work, The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844. He describes the horror of capitalist factories, children sleeping by the machines. You had workers who lived in quarters where a bed was never cold, because as soon as one set of people got out of the bed, another set would come in on shift. Impoverishment, fines, horrific conditions on the hulks that were used to clear the harbours, very important for shipping. And of course, then they were sent out to Australia, and there was a brutality here. I grew up in the island of Tasmania, which was actually the centre of two of the worst conditions. One was Macquarie Harbour, which is a wild place on the west coast of Tasmania, which was just Robert Hughes, in his book Fatal Shore, captures some of what happened there. And the other famous penal settlement was at a place called Port Arthur, where 1996 there was a horrible tragedy occurred, but it was a place. It was a place of tragedy. There were brutal conditions in which they were formed, but these brutal conditions, and this is very important for other questions we're going to discuss, came out of the development of industrial capitalism. That was their origin. The brutality was a product of this new system that was coming into being, and so on. So you couldn't settle Australia. What would you do? Put an advertisement in the London Times? We want some immigrants to come out to Australia? No. You had to use forced labour to do it. And you used forced labour to get workers to work in the factories. You had to use forced labour to establish this penal colony. Now, in some cases, the people who came out here did better off than if they had stayed in England. Such were the appalling conditions in Britain. But it was overall a product of industrial capitalism and its birth.
And the conditions on the the conditions on the ships. Is it safe to say that the way that the prisoners were transported on the ships that went to Australia, you can compare them to the way to the way African slaves were transported to the United States?
I think there were some parallels to the second fleet. The second, not so much on the first fleet, from my recollection, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think the second fleet conditions were appalling, and they are very similar, to this sort of, these conditions that were affected the African slaves, and it's the same process. Let's not forget that the voyages to the Pacific were also bound up with African slavery. They were intimately connected. For example, you've heard of the famous mutiny on the Bounty, of course. William Bligh was trained by Captain Cook. He was sent out. The mission of the Bounty was to go to the South Seas, right, Fiji and so on, the South Sea Islands, and they were looking for breadfruit. It's a crop there. What they wanted to do was get breadfruit trees, transport them to the West Indies, where the slave trade was going on, so that this would be a cheap food for the slaves. So it illustrates the point I'm making, that the history of the Pacific, Australia, the exploration here is bound up with the commercial expansion of the British Empire and with slavery. There's a direct, in that sense, a very direct correlation. They're part of the same process. Yes.
All right, and this leads to my second question, which is can you talk briefly, if you can, about Edmund Barton, who I guess you can say he was the founding father of Australia, and his party, the Protectionist Party, and I know when Australia was kind of became a self-governing colony, or became a sort of an independent country, one of the first things that was passed was the White Australia policy, in which only white people were allowed to emigrate to Australia, and it was explicitly a white society. And can you compare how that founding of that law, the White Australia policy, how that legacy is still there in Australia when we talk about the inhumane detention centers that refugees or boat people endure when they flee their countries and try to come to Australia.
Well, let me disabuse you of one notion first of all, Youri. Edmund Barton can in no way be described as the founding father. Let's take an example. We know who the founding fathers of the United States are: John Adams, Jefferson, Washington, Sam Adams. There are a whole nobody hardly knows. If you ask the ordinary person in the street who was the first and you ask most Americans who was the first president, they'll tell you George Washington, right?
Yeah.
They mightn't be able to tell you who he succeeded by, John Adams and then Jefferson and so on, but they'll tell you George Washington. If you took a vox pop in the street, and asked people who was the first Australian Prime Minister, they wouldn't be able to tell you. Very few would be able to tell you was Edmund Barton, right? It was, in a certain sense, an accidental figure. Because why I say that, the and that gets to the point which I'm leading to, of White Australia. White Australia was not developed by Edmund Barton. It was developed by the emerging labour and trade union bureaucracies. They developed the White Australia policy. And it very much connects with the founding of Australia. Let's take the situation, the founding of the nation state. The founding of America, and there's been much attacks on this in the New York Times with its racialist project, the Declaration of Independence was and remains a great step forward for humanity. Humankind took a step forward. when it was declared all men are created equal. And every movement against oppression, black, white, yellow, brown, whatever colour you want to name, starts with that proposition. Martin Luther King started with that. Every progressive movement has started with that great step forward. And it wasn't always accepted. So when we're talking about the founding of the American state, we're talking about a certain progress in mankind's development. And we have long settled our accounts, the Marxist movement, with the limitations of that bourgeois revolution. It could only accomplish certain things, but we don't throw away what it did accomplish. As I said, humankind made an advance. The same in the French Revolution. And it was more, you could say, protracted and violent, because in the French Revolution, what had to be done was to uproot the whole feudal society of the past. That took some doing. Again, a further step forward. Now, what can we say about Australia? When they came to form a nation, you see, the ruling classes here could not and did not make an appeal to democracy. Why? Because 100 and odd years had passed, 125 years since the Declaration of Independence in the United States in 1776. And what had emerged in Australia was a very powerful working class. It emerged in the 1890s in a series of strike struggles, battles, in some cases armed conflicts, an enormous upheaval. A working class had emerged. It was far, far too dangerous for the ruling classes to present themselves as emancipators, as democrats. We're liberating from British imperialism. No, they were tied by 1,000 strings to Britain, the crown. And so the Constitution, as formulated, has no ringing ideals like the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights of the United States or the, abolition of feudalism on August the 4th, 1789 in France, or any of these great milestones. It's a horse trading deal between British rule and the new rising capitalist class in Australia to decide how they're going to run the show. However, and it was regarded with a great deal of suspicion in the working class, having already come up against the power of the state in the preceding period. They had the idea, that the fat capitalists are trying to get together to put us down and strengthen their state apparatus. So who provided the cement, the ideological cement for the Australian capitalist nation state? It was the labour and union bureaucracies. And the thesis was, if we can have a new society in Australia, we keep everybody else out, a new society for Englishmen, for white population, keep the rest out with tariff barriers, and that's why protection is part of it. Keep out the masses of Asia, because we don't want them coming in, because that will give rise to a development of the class struggle. And in that, they had a unity, with the capitalist class. We don't want labour from Asia coming in because, they might decide to fight for their conditions, for their rights, and so on. And we'll have a big working class movement, and we can't handle it. And so it was the mechanism through which the emerging Labour Party, which was founded in 1890, trade unions, bureaucracies that were developing already in the 1890s, devised the ideological mechanisms for subordinating the working class to this state. So much so that the Labour Party in New South Wales, for example, had in its founding program up to 1965 in its objective, it said the cultivation of an Australian sentiment based on racial purity. That was the idea, that if we have this new society, then we don't have the class struggle of old Europe. We won't have the class battles and antagonisms. Well, of course, that was complete myth, because the history of Australia, like every other capitalist country, is a history of class struggle. And above all, those struggles have been fueled by developments internationally. They don't take place in isolation. Now, how does it relate to the present situation, the attacks on refugees and immigrants? Very directly, very directly. It's always used as a deflection from social problems. You see, the white Australia says we have the perfect society if we keep these other races out. So capitalist politicians down the years have used that and said, look, if we have social problems here, not enough housing, low wages, unemployment, and so on, it's because we have too many people coming from outside. And they have used this card. We'll have the yellow hordes, the black hordes, the brown hordes, whatever, coming down, and we've got to keep them out, and that's how we maintain social peace and living standards and so on. That's the myth. And when living standards go down, they play this card. And so that's why you have this, one of the worst. They're all, Australia, you could say, is a leader in anti-refugee policy. The Europeans have adopted much of what Australia has done. But the reasons go back to this mythology of, white Australia, this whole thesis, which has been at the centre of all the ruling, the Labor Party and all the other parties. The parties of Barton, there were three groupings. There was the Laborites, there was the Free Traders, and there was the Protectionists. These were the main groupings. But the Laborites provided the ideology for all of them around which they could all agree to found the Australian nation state on white Australia. And it was essentially the Labor Party policy that was passed by the first Parliament, not authored by Barton. And he, as I said, is very much a kind of accidental figure. And those who were the chief promoters of this pernicious ideology, was the Labor Party. Not, and I emphasise this, it's not a result of whiteness. It's a result of class society and the attempts of the Labor bureaucrats to develop an ideology that seeks to subordinate the working class and so to the capitalist state. And so, of course, at the very centre of our policies in the Socialist Equality Party, we make a very definite stand on this. We say everyone is a citizen of the world. The nation-state system is obsolete. It was progressive in its day, no question, but it is now historically obsolete, and everyone in the world has the right to live, work, take part in life to the fullest extent wherever they want to, whatever they want to, without barrier, without restriction.
And just a follow-up, just a follow-up question to that is, can you explain what exactly is the Australian point-based system? Because here in Europe, we've been hearing about how, Boris Johnson, is going, how he's getting Brexit done, and one idea that Nigel Farage kept champion, and now Boris Johnson's champion, is how they want to introduce an Australian point-based system. Can you explain what exactly that Australian point-based system is, and why we should be very, very nervous about a system like that being introduced in Britain?
Well, basically, it's another form of restriction, right? We have comrades in our party who'd be able to explain it better than me, but just to give you a brief summary, you get a point, I think, if you've got a relative here, if you've got certain qualifications, above all, if you've got money, there's no these things are all based ultimately on money. If you've got money, you can come. Unless, of course, you're regarded as an enemy of the state and you're regarded as having too close connections with China, and that's another story. You'll then be excluded because you'll be deemed to be an agent of the Chinese government. But basically, if you've got money, you can come. So the points-based system is, if you've got certain qualifications, if you've got certain things, then it adds up and so on. But it's another form of restriction. We say there's an unfettered, and it excludes a lot of people. For example, there's people from Vietnam, there's people from India, there's people from all over the world now in Australia. I mean, any school, there might be 50 nationalities there, Thank goodness. When I grew up, it was very, very different. But thank goodness it's changed. And it's had to change because, again, not because the ruling classes have changed their outlook, but because the economic situation changed. Australia could not continue onto the coattails of the British Empire forever. It had to trade in Asia. And so the White Australia policy was, so to speak, formally abandoned in the 1970s because you couldn't have an absolutely overtly racialist policy when you're trying to trade in Southeast Asia. So that was the reason for it. Again, now it's a point, as I said, it's a form of restriction. And it's used. So you have families that have sick parents, for example, who want to come out and live with their kids in their last years. They will be excluded. What economic value are they? Nil. So they're excluded. So again, we come back to the basic point that the only progressive stand that can be taken on this question, and here we have conflicts with many forces who try to say, we're liberal on immigration, but there should be some. No, we say once you start putting those barriers in, that's it. There must be an unfettered right of anybody to live, work in any country of their choice. One planet. That's it. And that's the only progressive policy that can be followed. So the points-based system is another form of restriction under so-called objective criteria, But as I say, money, as they say, doesn't talk, it swears, and in this case, money determines very much whether you graduate on the points-based system.
Unbelievable. And this is a pretty good segue, which is before we get into the history of the neo-Dickensian neoliberal period of Australia, can you talk to us briefly, if possible, not just on the huge nationwide solidarity protests that happened in Australia in response to the state murder of George Floyd, but how now I know the Australian media wanted to just focus on institutional racism in the US, but of course, with all these big protests, it was the perfect opportunity for the Aboriginal civil rights movement to address many of their grievances. And a lot of the protest was used to highlight Australia's institutional racism towards the Aboriginal, where there's an epidemic of deaths in custody, as well as much of the apartheid that Aboriginal people face. So can you talk, and I know that there was recent protests in Australia because January is when there's Australia Day, and a lot of Aboriginal people and their allies use that opportunity to protest against, lots of the lots of the injustices that Indigenous people still face in Australia. And your response to all.
Well, let me take a first point about the George Floyd protest. One thing that has to be, I think, emphasised about this. A number of people in the United States contrasted what happened at the Capitol on January the 6th with the invasion by Trump forces, the fascist forces, the stand down by police, who just let them in, as we now know, and the action of the police against the George Floyd protests, right? And they said, look at the contrast. Here we had white boys going into the Capitol, but on the George Floyd protests, because it was blacks, we had the attacks of the police. Now, that's a completely false picture, because if you look at the George Floyd protests, they were multiracial,
exactly.
And in fact, there were more whites than blacks. The class difference is the crucial question here, not the racial difference. George Floyd protests went far beyond Black Lives Matter. They were taken up by white youth who face, the same conditions as black youth, brown youth, Latino youth, and so on. Poverty, unemployment, the effects of COVID. I mean, a demonstration like that becomes a trigger point for a whole round of social grievances and opposition. The fact that you come out of college, if you're a white, Latino or black youth, whatever, you might have got great qualifications and you got 100,000 student debt, dollars, and there's no job. So these protests were multiracial, multi-ethnic. And of course, the same issue was raised in Australia. There is an ongoing repression of the Aboriginal population. I can go back to how that developed, but what we insist is, again, there's racialism, no question about it. It's embedded in the history of the Australian ruling class. But above all, the oppression of the Aboriginal population is a class question. They're the most oppressed section of the working class. It's not a white or black issue. And so therefore we oppose all of those measures which are sort of so-called Aboriginal enhancement, because what it does is actually create a privileged layer of the black population which rises up above its cohorts. The same thing has happened in the United States. We've had affirmative action now for 50 years. It was initiated by President Nixon, of all people. You have some of the sharpest income inequalities in the United States, and growth of inequality within the black community, black population, is sharper than in the rest of the population. You have a privileged black upper middle class. You have in this country an attempt to cultivate a privileged black upper middle class, which is about
continue.
Which is hostile above all to a socialist perspective, because we insist that the enormous crimes, and they are enormous, committed by Australian capitalism against the Indigenous population can only be overcome in the struggle for socialism. That's the only restitution, real restitution. And then a workers' government, a workers' state in which, you know, the black population, the black workers, white workers, Asian workers are involved as a class, will clean up and rectify and deliver justice to the crimes committed by capitalism in the course of its 200 and odd years history in this country and internationally. The crimes committed against the Indigenous population of the United States, the same, and so on. That's the only way of solving this question. Because let's go back just to the roots of this. The oppression of the Aboriginal population, right, in this country was not fundamentally a question of white versus black. Two different forms of property relations clashed. The hunter-gatherer society had to be destroyed, and the population with it incarcerated and driven off and poisoned, shot like pests and dogs, so that capitalist property could be developed. I grew up in Tasmania, the only place in the world, you know, where, yes, there's sections of the Aboriginal population continued on, but the entire original population was wiped out. It's the only place, you know, and that started. It didn't start with immediate settlement. It started in 1824, the Black Wars, as they were called, with the development of sheep farming in Tasmania and the fencing off of hunting lands, the development of sheep. The Aboriginals' hunting land was closed off. So what did they do? They had to kill the sheep. That's what they lived on. They lived on what was on the land. And so the farmers came out and the soldiers came out and they shot them like dogs. So it's a clash of two property forms: exclusive private property and primitive, first step, communal property of the tribal society. That's the clash. That's the clash, and that war went on starting in Tasmania, 1824. It went right across Australia.
The Frontiers War, right?
Beg pardon?
The Frontiers War, right?
Frontiers Wars went right to West Australia well into the 20th century. That's right. That's right. And it's about property. So it can only be resolved not within the framework of capitalist property, because that's the cause of the problem. It can only be resolved when new and higher, that is socialist property forms, are developed. That's the essential issue as we see it. And so we fight, of course, we recognise and have to acknowledge the great crimes committed by capitalism. But we say that's not going to be solved by putting more black faces in privileged positions, but only by overthrowing capitalism itself. And that's the task of the working class. And various representatives of the so-called blacks, they oppose us fundamentally on this question because they're not seeking the overthrow of capitalism, they're seeking a place within it. That's the essential difference.
So do you find a lot of the leadership of the Aboriginal people that the Australian corporate state media tends to prop up? Do you find do you compare them a lot to what people at Black Agenda Report call the Black misleadership class, or the kind of misleadership class that's developed in Maori politics in New Zealand, where they just prop up where like in the US they prop up black capitalism. In New Zealand, the land rights that the Maoris have won has only propped up Maori capitalism. And I think in the US, when it comes to the Native American population, it's a bit of a different story. But that in general,
well, not essentially different. They're into gambling and casinos, and some of them have made very big money out of that. Yeah, it's the same. You've hit on it, Youri. It's the same game all over the world. Some of the richest corporations in New Zealand, I don't have the figures with me, but some of the so-called tribal corporations are very wealthy, a very thin layer. But where's the Maori population? They're in the working class. Let's take just a very clear example today. Chicago, the teachers in Chicago are resisting being forced back to work under unsafe conditions. Now, who's doing the forcing? It's a black mayor of Chicago. She's threatening to stand down the teachers. So these are fundamentally class questions, not race questions. And there's been a huge attempt, New York Times in the lead, to rewrite American history and say it's a race question, not a class question. It's a class question. The Aboriginal worker working and we have important supporters and members into our party. Yabu Bilyana, who was a very important member of ours, he died some years ago. But he came to the understanding, and he went through all of these experiences, he came to the understanding that liberation of the Aboriginal people could only be accomplished through the struggle of the working class. All these forms of identity politics, it's not just race, sex, gender, all the rest of it, right, is all bound up with the seeking by certain elements of privilege within the capitalist system. Why? Because they've seen the fantastic, nothing like this we've seen in history. You're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in the United States, you're seeing it in Australia. The financial wheelers and dealers, they're accumulating money like you've never seen before in history. The ancien regime of France before the revolution was something. This is something else again. Jeff Bezos makes $80 billion out of COVID, and that has engendered tensions within the upper layers of society. You might say the 90% to the 99%, and then you have the top 1%. There's certain jealousies engendered within that layer. Oh, we want some of that wealth too. That's essentially what it's about, whether it's in movies, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in writing, whether it's in government, and of course corporations, go along with this and we'll put some black faces up there and we'll improve our image and so on and so forth. But it doesn't matter to her work. Chicago is just a perfect illustration. Does it matter if Lightfoot is black, white, or whatever? No, she's launching an attack on the teachers.
And just one follow-up thing before I get into before I get into this next topic, then is I more or less agree with a lot of what you and your colleagues at the World Socialist website say when it comes to when it comes to the whole idea of the class struggle, and that doesn't matter if you're black, if you're queer, if you're indigenous, if you're white. It's all of us, the working class, who must unite to overthrow this unjust system of capitalism. But what do you say to people who say that the criticism that you might receive, that you're being too class reductionist, because yes, indigenous people face face the problems that that somebody coming out of college faces, which is lack of opportunity, jobs going overseas, being exploited. But because of the theft of Aboriginal people's lands and them being put onto reserves, that's a unique discrimination they face compared to compared to what the average white working class person faces. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well. I think.
We have some experience in this. I mean, 1992, in Australia, we had the Mabo legislation. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it was a case brought by Eddie Mabo, and the High Court recognised native title. It actually said this wasn't terra nullius, empty continent, empty country. There were people here, and they had native title property rights. So it tried to, it put forward this solution. Now, what has happened, and you can look at, I just was reading recently some, summing up of that experiences. That's now nearly 30 years ago.
Yeah.
What's happened is there are enormous fights now between different groups of Aboriginal people about who owns the land, who has the right to make a deal with the mining companies, who gets what, and so on. I mean, certain experiences have been gone through. All this stuff about, we'll get the land title back and that'll solve our problems. No, it started a fight among different competing groups. It solved absolutely nothing. And the average worker, Aboriginal worker, a student, the people facing in horrific conditions in the Northern Territory and elsewhere. Why? Because funding's cut. That's the problem they face, not land title. So they go and do land title, and then you have a deal done, with a company like, one of these big mining companies, a certain privileged layer gets some benefit out of it, and so on. But the population doesn't. Conditions have worsened over the past 30 years. Now, why is funding being cut? Funding's been cut because fundamentally the ruling class regards any expenditure on social services provisions as a deduction of the wealth that would otherwise be available to it as profit. So it's hostile to that. Real funding has been cut. That's the problem. And that's a class question related to the functioning of the capitalist economy. So all of these things, of course, there are particular conditions of particular workers and so on. There are particular problems facing youth, which are different, you could say, from the particular problems facing older workers. Yes, there's certainly discrimination continues against women. No one's going to deny that. And why would we? But all of these questions are, bound up with oppression, suppression of democratic rights can only be solved on the basis of a socialist perspective, not on the basis of, you try to deal with this one and that one. Because, as I said, the experience has shown. And what's the experience in America? Gaming rights to those on the reservations of the native population. Some of them get fabulously wealthy, and the conditions of the Native Americans in those communities goes from bad to worse. It's the same question here.
Interesting. All righty, then that leads to that leads to this fourth question I wanted to ask, which is, and you can probably even talk about the coronavirus when in this context, which is, can you explain to an audience how the Australian federal and local government's response has been to the coronavirus, and is Australia's healthcare system as well as its educational system, is it mainly private and overpriced, and and has it been under and has the public universities and the public healthcare system been under attack by privatization and capitalist reforms. And the reason why I ask that is because John Pilger, a fellow Australian who's based in Britain, he recently did his second documentary on the assaults of the NHS and how the NHS has been de facto privatized.
Yeah.
And is it the same thing in Australia? When we talk about is it the same thing in Australia? So talk about that. And
well, certainly the public health system, which was established firstly brought forward by the Whitlam government, one of its reforms in 1972-73. The Medibank system, Medicare system, which was then attacked and then reintroduced. That was a certain reform. And it's been under attack in every way possible, and so on. I mean, one of the features of it was supposed to be.
So Australia only had their version of a single-payer healthcare only in the 70s when Whitlam.
Yeah, that's right. It started then. Before that, and it was a very, very popular move. And it was bitterly opposed. Before that, you had to have private, insurance, or you just went on the public, you turned up at a hospital and got what you could take, Initially, it was supposed to be on the basis of what they call bulk, you go to a GP, and it was supposed to be bulk billing. That is, you go to the GP, you charge the standard fee by the government, and I still manage to do that, and others do, and you don't pay anything, right? Because it's covered by but progressively the real value of that bill that doctors get recompensed with has been driven down in real terms. So there's been a pressure all the time for private funding, private hospitals and so on. And there's a two-tier system. And if you're in a private fund and paying lots of money, you can get instant hospital treatment. If you have, need a hip replacement or something that's not deemed to be life-threatening, but if you've got bad hips and you need a hip replacement, you're in constant pain, but that's not deemed, so you have to wait. If you're on the public system, if you're in the private system, you go straight through. So there's a two-tier system, there's a continuous erosion, there's a continuous winding down of real spending on health all the time. And again, it comes down to the same issue. You have the enormous growth of finance capital, fabulous wealth at the top, but anything that's spent on social services ultimately is regarded by the financial elites as a deduction from what value they're able to incorporate. And so we saw the same processes in Australia, not perhaps to the same degree as elsewhere. One, because, the COVID hasn't struck here, and I'll come back to that point, struck here the same way as internationally. But you had the same problems, shortages of PPE, shortages of equipment. I mean, had COVID-19 struck here like it did, say, in Italy, you would have had the same processes. The reason it didn't, there are a number of reasons. You could say it's a bit of a mystery. Why has Australia not had the same level of COVID that you've had in Europe, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere? Well, I would say a couple of factors involved in this, right? One is that you might remember at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, this country was engulfed, the eastern part was engulfed by a bushfire disaster. I mean, it was an absolute... Yeah. I mean, this was world news. Nothing like it had been seen. And there was tremendous opposition to the government of Scott Morrison. Morrison, in the middle of the bushfires, went away on numerous incidents happened. He went away on holidays secretly to the Pacific. He said, "Look, I can't do anything. I'm not holding a hose. I can't do anything." It revealed a whole number of things. A government, one, of climate deniers, climate change deniers. Clearly, this was caused by this. Underfunding to rural fire services, fire chiefs who had been warning of this in a bit the same way as COVID. People had warning of this for some time to come. We've got to make preparations. No preparations were made. His government and Morrison, the sort of high point of this came, he went down to the south coast of New South Wales, tried to glad hand and, be on hand to, meet the people. They just turned up and people wouldn't shake his hand. They wouldn't have any. There was a real
crisis. Met with many people heckling him and protesting.
That's right. Yeah. There was a real crisis of the government. So he was very fearful. When COVID struck, his first reaction was, oh, look, it's nothing, it'll blow away. His first reaction was like Trump. But then, fearful of opposition in the working class and opposition in the broad masses of the population, especially in the wake of the bushfire crisis, an opposition which said, no, not again. You're not doing this again. The government had to take some limited measures, which it has continually tried to lift at every stage. And we've got the same problems. It hasn't been to the same effect. They've managed to contain and control some of it because Australia is an island and it does, they have been able to do that. So they've been able to, but the other thing that is important to note, and this is very decisive because it comes to the class question, the attitude of every government has been, no, profit, not health measures, are essential. I mean, the way you deal scientifically with this question is very clear. And experts more knowledgeable than me, Osterholm in the United States, for example, has said it. You shut down the economy for 6 to 8 weeks, you pay compensation for those who are non-essential workers, and you deal with it. That's how you deal with it. And you have to pay compensation to those people who are still, well, where's it going to come from? Well, some of the money that Bezos is making on Wall Street could go to paying workers who are stood down while this emergency is dealt with scientifically. Now, that's not what happened. From March, April onwards, in the United States, we had the mantra of Thomas Friedman, the cure cannot be worse than the disease. In other words, profits must triumph over health. And that's been the essential question here in Australia as well. And so what we've seen, while we haven't seen the same effects as COVID, on the actual disease as we've seen elsewhere, we've seen a tax on workers' conditions, cuts in workers' conditions, penalty rates being abolished. The employers want to use this crisis to restructure industrial relations and to push back further. So they're doing the same thing as they're doing in Europe and the United States. They're doing that here, although the health effects of the COVID crisis haven't been as great. But the same class phenomenon is there.
And at the moment, So at the moment, just to clarify, so Australia still does have a single-payer system, but it has been under assault since the 80s by those who continuously want to introduce privatization and or capitalist reforms in the system.
That's right. Yeah, it is. And you have a dual system. You have the single-payer system, Medicare, where you have your card and so on. But you have a private system that exists alongside it, and it continually strives to make inroads. And they strive to make the point that, to get really top-quality healthcare, which should be available to everybody, it's a two-class system. If you're in private medicine, you get better healthcare. There should be one. It should be universal. Top quality for all, and the resources are there to do it. But it's very profitable, has been very profitable, and of course the Medicare system was opposed right from the outset by these major insurance companies who make a lot of money out of it, and they're continually seeking to erode. Just one last point though, Youri, I would make. The private health system, and it's the same in the United States, it's the same everywhere, the private health system it rests upon the public health system. If you take away the public health system, it wouldn't exist. And even if you take drug company research, in the United States, most of the basic research is done by the National Institute of Health, the NIH. It's done in universities. Yes, the private companies come in at the end and sort of market it and make a drug out of it and so on, make fabulous profit. But the basic research is done at public expense, public universities, public institutions, paid for by taxpayers' money, by the resources of society. That's the basic issue of any health system. It's not some individual geniuses, that are making it. All of these things are based upon a whole vast development of science which has gone before.
And then let's get to this question. To this question, we'll talk about the educational system in Australia for another time, unless we have time after some of these questions. Which is okay. So now going back in time to history. Now Australia has always been a country, like many others, as you mentioned, where there's constant class struggles. Many gains have been won by the working class, but they've always been fragile gains. And Australia, like other countries, especially in the Five Eyes Alliance, has 2 or 4 more rival oligarchic parties squabbling. But I want to focus on the history of regression and class struggles from the 70s onwards. So can you talk to us, because you mentioned his name, so can you talk to us about the legacy of Gough Whitlam, the Labour Prime Minister, how he was sacked in an Australian Anglo-American coup launched by, the deep state, and how it ushered in the period of the first new Labour leader, which was Bob Hawke, who was Tony Blair before Tony Blair even came to Brexit.
Okay, well, let's go back to the, if we can just look at the situation. You say there's constant class struggle. In the last 30 years, one has to say in Australia, as everywhere else, the class struggle has by and large been suppressed by the trade union bureaucracy, and that's the most enduring legacy, you could say, or come to it, of Hawke, Keating, and so on. But if you go back to I'd place it in this context. End of the war, Second World War, the ruling classes all over the world faced a real problem, because they knew if they went back to the conditions of the 1930s, then they were going to face social revolution. Workers hadn't gone through the World War II and the horrors of the fight against fascism to go back to what they were in the 30s. And a vast restructuring of capitalism had to be undertaken by America. There were enormous upheavals of the working class in country after country, France, Italy, and including in Australia as well. Class relations were to a certain extent settled in Australia in 1949 by the post-war Chifley Labor government, which brought out the troops against a miners' strike for higher wages. And that, to a certain extent, established the foundations of what was to come, the sort of post-war boom of the 50s and 60s. Class relations were then, at that point, at that period, regulated through the arbitration system, the industrial system, so-called industrial umpire. There were struggles, there were militant struggles, but they were relatively contained. But by the 60s, and it's only a 20-year period, it's amazing when you look back at it, 49 to 1969 is only 20 years. It's like from here to 2001. I mean, it's really when I look back now, I thought at that time, looking back 20 years, that's a long time. It's not. By 1969, you had a very powerful movement of workers that was developing, as was developing internationally. Major and general strike in France, a real upsurge of the working class in Britain, and an upsurge of the working class in Australia. And one of the ways in which this whole system was enforced was a system of penalties. If unions went outside of the arbitration system, they were subject to fines and even jail sentences. And increasingly, there was a rising tide of opposition to this. And in May of 1969, under pressure from rank and file workers, one of the leaders of the union, Tramways Union in Victoria, was fined and jailed for non-payment, for going outside the regulation system, was jailed, and a general strike was developing across Australia in 3 days in May. I mean, it was palpable. In typical Australian fashion, you wouldn't believe this, but the British have very sophisticated ways of doing this, but in Australia it's more blatant. What they did over the weekend, they discovered a lottery winner, an unnamed lottery winner, who was going to, this country of gambling, who was going to pay the fines of the jailed union leader and got him out of jail and halted the general strike movement that was taking place. But this was the end of the Liberal government, essentially. Later that year, the Labor Party, which had been out of office.
I just have to interrupt very quickly. When we talk about Australian politics, the Liberal Party, that's the equivalence of the Republican Party in the U.S., the Conservative Party in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yes, it's called the Liberal Party, but really they're fiscally and also socially very
conservative.
Very conservative. So just had to mention that.
Their policies for dealing with the working class were in tatters. They couldn't enforce this because ultimately this policy hadn't depended on their strength. It had depended upon the union bureaucracies keeping the working class in check. Now, Whitlam came to office really with a pledge. You could say to the ruling classes, look, I will regulate the class struggle and seek to contain it. I'll make reforms, and there are reforms that are necessary. You know, the Liberal Party was somewhat outmoded as far as Australian capitalism was concerned. Whitlam's, visit to China, for example. Foreign policy had to be modernised. He was denounced, and then, of course, Nixon and Kissinger went to China, and they all the conservatives ended up with egg on their faces. Whitlam was, to a certain extent, a moderniser of the bourgeois state, of the capitalist state, and its apparatus. But the main issue he pledged was to keep the working class in check. Now, he came to office in 1972 on a very powerful movement of opposition to 23 years of Liberal rule, in the working class. And at the end, he came to power in December of 1972. At the end of 1973, he put forward a referendum that we will have state control over prices and wages, a prices and incomes policy. We want to modernise the state, and this was always Whitlam's basic theme. If you go back to his history from when he joined the Labor Party in 1944, he was not, a Labor politician who represented the working class. His ideology was very much modernising the capitalist state.
Okay.
And that was his policy that he put forward in 73 in this referendum. And it failed. Workers just voted it down. We're not having the state control wages because we know where that is going to go. Harold Wilson had tried the same thing in Britain in 1966 with Barbara Castle, in place of strife policy, and so on. And in 1974, workers had remained relatively quiet in the first year of the Whitlam government. The attitude was, let's see how they go. Let's see what they do. We don't want to rush. We've waited long enough. We can wait a bit longer. But 74, amidst inflation and, of course, the development of a deepening crisis of capitalism globally, 1971 was the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The gold backing was removed from the US dollar. Inflation started to rise. There were rising struggles of workers everywhere. There were mass movements in Latin America. Of course, we had the movement that brought Allende to power in 1970. We had the coup in 1973. And the same fears governed the ruling class here. Amidst an upsurge of the working class in 1974, the ruling class determined, look, we're fearful. Whitlam made us promises, but he can't contain this movement. And it was reflected most sharply in the Murdoch press. Murdoch had backed Whitlam in 1972. By the May election of 1974, which actually was precipitated by the same thing that caused the coup, the refusal of the Senate to pass bills in the upper house, to pass bills introduced by the government, Murdoch moved away from Whitlam. Then you had an orchestrated plot. In 1975, it involved the CIA. It involved Sir John Kerr, who was a CIA man from way back. In the war, he had served with intelligence communities. He informed the royal family. I mean, he was collaborating with the British state and the CIA. The Snowman and the Falcon guy, look, his name just escapes me. the guy who did the documentary on him about the ousting of the Whitlam government. The CIA referred to as Kerr as our man. He had connections going back, and the decision was made to sack Whitlam. But the most important thing about the coup, as it was, of November the 11th, 1975, it could not have succeeded.
Oh, sorry to interrupt again. The name of the person you were looking for, I think his name is Christopher Boyce.
Yeah, Christopher Boyce, that's right. Yeah. If you look him up, he explains very well. This was a CIA operation, Snowman and the Falcon. But the most important factor in allowing the coup to succeed, all these plots, and let's recall, in 1973, Nixon and Kissinger are planning and assisting the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile. Kissinger says, look, we don't regard the vote of the people. If they're stupid enough to vote a Marxist in, not that Allende was one, we'll get rid of them. They just suffered an enormous defeat in Vietnam in May of 1975. Indonesia, which they'd helped put Suharto in power 10 years before, crises were erupting there, the question of Timor and so on. And interestingly enough, the US ambassador to Australia, one Marshall Green, when he was appointed, I think in 1974, a Labor Senator, Bill Brown, got up in the Senate and correctly said, look, everywhere this man goes, Marshall Green, there is a coup. He'd been in Japan with MacArthur at the end of the Second World War. He'd been in Korea when the Syngman Rhee dictatorship came in 1961. He was in Indonesia, around Indonesia in 1965, and he was appointed to Australia in 1974. And I remember we wrote an article in Perspective, an editorial.
And this guy's name again was what?
Marshall Green.
In Australian, though. He
was a US ambassador to Australia.
Oh, yeah.
Senator Bill Brown, a Labor senator, got up in the Senate and said, look, here's a warning. Everywhere this guy goes, there's a coup. And he was right. Absolutely right. But even all of those factors, the most important factor in allowing the coup to succeed was the attitude of the labour and trade union bureaucracy. Because I very well remember, I was covering it at the time, the afternoon of November the 11th, country's ready for a general strike. The government they've elected twice has just been sacked. Hawke is at a press conference, I think, in Brisbane. He's asked, Mr. Hawke, what is the attitude of the union movement to this? The ACTU will be meeting tomorrow. What are you going to... Hawke says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but this is accurate, it's important that the people respond to leadership. We're on the edge of something terrible. We could see the unleashing, we could have the unleashing of forces the like of which we have never seen. What he was afraid of was the eruption from below. If the ACTU had met the next day, or Hawke had said, we're having a meeting of the ACTU executive tomorrow, we are not going to stand by and see the government that working men and women of this country elected democratically twice in 3 years, removed by a conspiracy of the Governor-General, the CIA and the rest, and I will be putting a motion for a strike tomorrow, the country would have stopped. And you would have had very powerful, as Hawke said, you would have had the unleashing of forces the like of which we've never seen. Because a general strike, which would have emerged, posed the question, well, who's to be master in the house? Who is actually going to rule? It exposed so openly and nakedly the real class relations in Australia, that behind the facade of parliamentary democracy and voting and elections and all the paraphernalia is really a dictatorship. And the military, it's not a democracy underneath. It is just the outer shell of what is essentially a dictatorship of the ruling interests, of the ruling classes. And that had to be stopped. And so they played the most powerful role. And that was to set the stage for the next stage of development.
And before I ask you about the legacy of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, so the reason, because that's always a question in the back of my mind, which is why didn't the working class just go just do a mass general strike in response to the coup that happened towards Gough Whitlam, who was very much who did introduce sweeping left-wing reforms and was very much he advocated détente. He got troops out of Vietnam. Apart from what he did to East Timor, he was more or less good on foreign policy. But that always strikes me. Why wasn't there huge working class revolt against his coup? But as you just explained,
there was huge opposition. There was huge opposition, and there were attempts to do that. I recall, just as an individual anecdote, I was among a group of workers the following day, walked off from dockyards and around Sydney and invaded the stock exchange, But without a coordinated focus, there were moves for general strike everywhere. But let's not forget, Hawke had a certain political capital. Hawke had been promoted in the preceding period as a left-winger, as a militant. In 1969, for example, he came to the presidency of the ACTU late in 69. The leadership of the ACTU, that's the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the peak body of the union movement, had been led by a very conservative, right-wing, Cold War warrior, you could say, and they existed in the trade unions, called Albert Monk. It was clear after the May general strike of 1969 that a new leadership was going to be necessary, because this strike took place over the heads of the ACTU. They had to get a left face in. And very interestingly, Bob Hawke gave and John Pilger, to his credit, documents much of this. He gave an address, the Communist Party May Day address of May 1969 in Sydney. And so you had Hawke was backed for the presidency of the ACTU by the American attaché of the Labour attaché in the American embassy and the Communist Party. So you had these both coming together, and he was portrayed as a left. So he had this reputation. And workers took leadership. Workers don't just, they take the questions of leadership and organisation seriously. And at this point, they had support for Hawke. That, and in the subsequent years, you found many workers saying we should have had a general strike. Hawke betrayed it. They began to draw lessons about what had happened. But Hawke still had a certain left credentials in 1975 that he used to exploit, you could say, what do they call political capital, that he expended on behalf of the ruling class. He never had the image of the left orator and so on, really after that. But that political capital was expended. You see the same phenomenon in a different form in the United States today. What do the Democrats call for unity with the Republicans, who've just tried to oust them in a fascist coup, which most of the Republicans support. Why didn't they call for a strike against Donald Trump's attempted coup? In fact, had organizations that were actively involved in preventing that taking place. Because what the Democrats, what the DSA fear, above all, far, far more than they fear fascism, is an eruption from below. And we've seen this before in history. When Hitler came banging on the door in France in 1940, the alternatives were an upsurge of the working class or a collaboration with the fascists. What did the French ruling class do? Marshal Pétain, the Vichy regime, and so on. So this is a universal historical phenomenon. You know, these agencies fear the working class far more than they fear fascism.
Although the Democrats are now trying to impeach Donald Trump, even though he's not the president anymore. But then this leads to, all right. So you explained perfectly why how what would have been a popular revolt was contained by a betrayal of the union bureaucracy and Bob Hawke. So this leads
and Whitlam as well. Whitlam as well.
How Whitlam? How Whitlam? Do explain. But before we get into
he went along with this. He went along with this. You know, his famous phrase was "maintain your rage," but maintain your rage until the next day of the election. You know, until the day of the election, and of course the Fraser government won the election. Why? Because he'd been placed in power without opposition. So millions of sections of the middle class who can swing the balance in elections, they go whichever side they regard as stronger. The weakness of the Labor rights had been demonstrated, absolutely. You know, Fraser had been allowed to appear as the powerful man by the betrayals of the trade union Labor bureaucracy. So Whitlam went along with that. He didn't oppose Hawke. In fact, he relied on Hawke because he feared this. And in fact, Whitlam said in one of the speeches that he made in the lead up to the November coup that he saw his main task as leader of the Labor Party was to reconcile opposition forces in the working class to the parliamentary system under conditions where you just had a major and general strike in France. The whole question of power was posed in France, where you'd had enormous upheaval. This is the 60s, late 60s and 70s. You know, there are Portugal. There's a whole series of enormous upheavals developing. Chile. And Whitlam made it very clear his task was the subordination of the working class to the parliamentary system, certainly not its overthrow. And that was what was posed in embryonic form in the question of, the actual establishment of a workers' government.
Wow. So now we're on to I hate the term neoliberal period, but now we're officially on to the neoliberal period, or as I prefer to call it, the neo-Keynesian period, which is, so talk to us about Bob Hawke and and let me see if I have my notes here. So talk to us about the legacy of Bob Hawke and his successor, Paul Keating. Now, Bob Hawke passed away May 2019, and when he did, I was stunned how he received unanimous praise I shouldn't be surprised, but he received unanimous praise in much of the Australian corporate state press. And even international left-leaning media outlets like Qatar's Al Jazeera gave Hawke favorable treatment. But explain to an Australian international audience Hawke's legacy as well as his successor, Paul Keating, because as I mentioned before, he was New Labour before New Labour came to Britain in the form of Gordon Brown, of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown.
Yeah. Is my face getting a bit dark here? Should I put a light on you?
Oh no, it's perfect. It's fine.
It's all right. Okay. Well, let's look at the legacy. You could say the legacy of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating is the enormous problems that confront workers today. It's a living legacy. Let me just take up the story again. 75, the Labor rights are ousted. And they're out of office for 7 years. But the Fraser government that came to power could solve none of the problems that faced the Australian capitalist system. And of course, we know by the beginning of the 80s, we had the two deepest recessions since the 30s in that period. And we had Reagan and Thatcher came to power. The Fraser government was in no position to carry out the measures of Reagan and Thatcher, the attack on the working class. In no position. The government,
that's interesting because he's from the Liberal Party. The more
he could not do it. And in fact, they admitted John Howard, who became his successor, said the problem we face, and if you go back to the Liberal Party, they say the Fraser government was wasted years. But Howard explained in one of his more perceptive moments why they couldn't do it. He said because in 1975, we stretched the fabric of society to breaking point. We came very close to an all-out crisis. And so they had to... So what was the conclusion of the labour rights? The conclusion of the labour rights was this, and they discussed it over years. The next time we're called to office, Bill Kelty, one of the ACTU officials, put it this way. He said, we let things get out of control. In other words, the working class got out of control in 74, 75. The union bureaucracy did not have a sufficiently strong mechanism to suppress the class struggle. And the ruling class drew the conclusion that until Labor got some of those mechanisms in place, it could not be allowed back into office. And so, as Kelty said, that's what they did for the 7 years. And they devised a policy which was unveiled before the elections, Prices and Incomes Accord, an agreement a tripartite agreement between the government, the unions and employers to suppress the living standards of the working class, to prevent the outbreak of wage struggles, and above all, as it developed, to restructure Australian industry. And so what was done by Reagan and Thatcher in the United States, which was an all-out assault, the end of Keynesian measures, the end of the post-war boom, capitalism, it wasn't just a recession. Capitalism had to actually be restructured internationally.
Yeah.
And so it was. And the instrument for that restructuring in Australia was the Hawke-Keating government. And if you take discussion today in the Murdoch press, the Australian Financial Review here, a leading voice of big business, there isn't a week goes by, sometimes not a day goes by, without them saying that the platform we have to adopt is the Hawke-Keating agenda. That was what was done. And what did you have in that period? You had the destruction of independent working class organisations. The trade unions became a police force. Shop committees that had developed, like independent organisations of workers in factories. There was one in Sydney, a famous one, Hawker de Havilland aircraft factory. Committees of workers were smashed up, not by the employers, but by the trade union leadership, the leadership of the so-called most militant metal unions. The AMWU smashed up. They produced a program at the 1987 peak trade union congress called Australia Reconstructed. It was written largely by a leading member of the Stalinist Communist Party, Laurie Carmichael. It was a platform for making Australian capitalism more internationally competitive. And for that to happen, you had to destroy workers' conditions that had been won in the past. Keating carried out those changes in the financial sector, privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, privatisation of Qantas, privatisation of government-owned enterprises. So that was his beat. At the same time, in the unions, it was Kelty, the secretary of the ACTU. He sort of took over the leadership after Hawke had moved on to become Prime Minister, and other union bureaucrats. But above all, it was the Communist Party officials in the trade unions who enforced the Prices and Incomes Accord. And when one section of workers tried to break out of that, the pilots union in 1989 said, look, we're not going along with this accord. We want a wage rise and we're going to fight for it like we've fought for in the past. The industry was shut down and troops were brought in with the support of the ACTU, the peak union bodies, completely supported the use of troops. So in a sense, you have a sort of repeat. 1949, Chifley Labor government brought troops in against the miners and stabilised class relations for the next 20 years. 1989, we had this enforcement of the accord, ultimately through the full force of the state, its armed forces. Now, what's happened now in the past 30 years is that strike levels and industrial activity is at an all-time low in Australia, all-time low. Not because wages have gone up, wages have gone down. Whole sections of industry have been destroyed. But beneath this, there's an enormous social explosion building up. We're going to have an eruption of the class struggle. But it's not going to take place through the trade unions. It's going to take place independently. That's why our party fights for independent organisations of the working class. The trade unions have demonstrated completely they're the policemen of the capitalist state. That's what they've done.
Interesting. And then how has Hawke and Keating's legacy? How did that sort of open the doors for the legacy of So how did Hawke and Keating's legacy open the doors for what the working class had to endure under John Howard and, of course, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard? And John Howard was of the Liberal Party. So talk about how about the suffering that the working class had to endure.
Well, you see, basically Howard didn't do anything. All the hard work, the heavy shifting, was done by the Labourites from 1983 to 1996. The destruction of conditions, the destruction of wages, the new agreements, the enterprise bargaining was done by Keating and Hawke. Now, Howard went along. He did certain limited things, very limited. But then he got control of both houses of Parliament, the Senate, and sections of his party said, we've got to go ahead. We've got to press ahead with the advantage. And they introduced industrial relations legislation called work choices, which was basically a further destruction of conditions. What happened? There was massive opposition in the working class, such that the ACTU had to organise a very limited campaign, which they sought to restrict, but there were mass turnouts of workers. I mean, in Melbourne, there were 100,000 workers demonstrated on the streets, against work choices. There were other demonstrations. There was a very big opposition in the working class.
And work choices. Can you explain what that is? Is that like a sort of anti-union bill?
It was to eliminate really any basic rights and conditions. It was to give even more the whip hand to employers. Right now, what happened? Well, the Howard government was overthrown, voted out in 2007. The Prime Minister, Mr. John Howard, even lost his own seat in that election. So what happened? The Labourites came in and they said, no, we won't do work choices. We'll do a thing called Fair Work Australia, a new set of industrial relations which they brought in, which now make it illegal for workers to take solidarity action. For example, we have a lockout taking place now.
This under Kevin Rudd's.
That's exactly right. Rudd, Gillard, they did it. For example, we have a lockout of Coles workers, right, in Sydney. They're trying to automate the plant and shut it down and send these workers out with nothing. The problem that is now faced, and workers say, it's raised, well, we should go out in solidarity and we should strike with them. We should support them. We should take industrial action. That's illegal. The union bureaucrats come down and say, you can't do that. That is illegal under the laws. Laws put in and agreed by the Labor Party, by Rudd, by Gillard, and by the entire trade union leadership. So workers are actually fighting against laws introduced by their own leaderships and their own so-called Labor governments. So That's the situation. Howard has not done anything, really, and didn't do anything, couldn't do anything. Yes, certain limitations, they made certain changes, but not the essential heavy lifting against the working class has always been done by the Labor Party. And, Scott Morrison hasn't done a great deal. He's talking about this and that, and every time, and what's the chorus? As I said, goes up from the employers. Yes, you want to do some industrial relations reform? We need the Hawke-Keating template. That's where you've got to start from. So that's the situation. That's the legacy. Workers are
why in your opinion, why do you think Kevin Rudd, who was not a flaming left winger by any means, he was. I mean, you can't even compare the guy to a Gough Whitlam.
no, you can't.
Why? Why was he overthrown then by why was he overthrown by his own party, and then Julia Gillard replaced him? Did that have to do with Kevin Rudd wanting to introduce a super tax on the mining companies?
That might have a marginal factor. That wasn't the essential reason. And Youri wasn't overthrown by his own party. That we've got to establish. It was not overthrown by the party. This was an extra party operation. This did not take place through the party. In fact, the day or 2 days, it was 2 days before the Monday or the Tuesday. It was overthrown on the Wednesday night, the Thursday morning. So it's a Monday or Tuesday. There was a meeting of the Labor Party caucus. Nobody put up their hand to replace him. I mean, that's where leaders get changed. I mean, yes, Keating overthrew Hawke, but it was done in the caucus. Keating put up his hand, says, I'm standing against you for leadership in the caucus. Caucus votes, all right. This didn't happen. The actual mechanics of it was that on Wednesday night, after the caucus had met, elected Labor Party spokesman, Paul Howes, for example, of the Australian Workers' Union, who nobody knows, not a parliamentarian, is a union bureaucrat, is telling us that, Rudd's gone. This was organised, as we were to later reveal, Mark Arbib, an official of the New South Wales Labor Party, Paul Howes, and, of course, Bill Shorten. One thing they all had in common: protected sources, and this is the term used by the American Embassy, as WikiLeaks revealed at the end of 2010, protected sources of the US Embassy. Now, what was the difference with Rudd? As you rightly say, not a flaming left-winger by any stretch of the imagination. But he did have one significant difference, and that was on the question of China. Because in 2009, 2010, we have a shift in the policy orientation of the United States under the Obama administration. They basically say, look, George Bush has got us into these wars in the Middle East. That's really not where the orientation of America has got to be. We don't face great dangers on the, war on terror. Yes, it's had its uses politically, but that's not where our fire's got to be directed. The issue is China and the growth of China. And particularly, this became very important after the 2008 crisis. Because after all, before the whole world, the mythology of the great strength of American capitalism was revealed, wasn't it? I mean, it was a nest of vipers, of parasitism, and to use the words of the US Senate, of criminality, of corruption, the subprime crisis and everything that followed. The enormous economic weakness of American capitalism was revealed before the world. On the other hand, we have the increase over the period, the rise of China. Yeah. And the American imperialism said, look, under the Obama administration, and the Democrats are always the ones who initiate this sort of stuff, China's the threat. So Obama launches the pivot to Asia.
Yes.
Right? 2009, 2010, Hillary Clinton is the author of it, or she writes in Foreign Affairs on it, about how this has got... Obama says we've got to transfer 60% of our naval and air forces to the Pacific. China is the issue. Now, Rudd had a different, in other words, complete mobilization, really, of forces within this region against the rise of China. They had all kinds of battle plans to strangle China and so on. Established bases. They had a thing called the Air-Sea Battle Plan, which is a whole plan. I won't go into it here, but it's about strangling China.
Yeah.
Rudd had a disagreement. Rudd said, look, and Rudd's a Chinese scholar and so on. He says, look, you can't simply crush China. You've got to give China, I know, you've got to give China some room to move. We've got to have an Asia-Pacific community. China's got to have some space. You can't just go all out in this way. And that was the disagreement. That was the disagreement. Now, look what happened, right? Let's just follow the course of events. Obama was scheduled to come out to make a visit while Rudd was Prime Minister to Australia. The visit of an American president, is always a big deal for a Prime Minister. Twice it was postponed. For some reason, once there was a, hurricane in Haiti, and then there was a scheduling. He didn't come. What happens? He's removed 2010 by protected. The main operatives were not the caucus. That's why I say it's not the party. The party woke up the next morning, on the Thursday morning, hang on, Rudd's out. When did that happen? I mean, that's what the reaction of the party knew nothing about it.
Wow.
I mean, the party knew, put it this way, when Keating challenged Hawke, right, no one was surprised. Everyone knew that was on. They knew Keating was going to, the party knew. And there were people lined up one way or the other, so on and so forth, right? But, nobody knew this was going to happen. This was a coup, overnight coup. Paul House is on television at 10:30 at night. Most people have gone to bed telling us that Rudd's not going to be fronting up tomorrow because we've got rid of him. We've pulled union support and we've done this and we've done that. What happened then? Well, then Gillard goes on. What's her first speech? Her first speech is to emphasise the importance of the American alliance. And we know Gillard had been vetted by the American embassy. Her credentials had been discussed. There was some concern she had been on the left of the party. The American ambassador was told, no, don't worry about that. She's fine.
Wow.
And what happens in 2011? The pivot to Asia, one of the most important foreign policy initiatives of any American administration. I mean, after all, they're saying, we are pivoting to Asia. We are going to put 60% of our resources, military resources, to the Asian region. That's not announced from the Oval Office. It's not announced in a statement to Congress. It's not officially announced in the Rose Garden. It's announced on the floor of the Australian Parliament in November 2011, combined with a new agreement to place American troops on Australian soil for the first time since World War II, a rotation base to Darwin. Now, that's why Kevin Rudd was removed, because he had not a great opposition, not, flaming opposition to America on China, but a nuance, you could say a nuanced position. Look, we just should make a little room of accommodation. That could not be tolerated. And he was removed. And Rudd knows that. He never speaks about it, but he knows it. That's why he was done in. And of course, the mining companies, yes, they got in on the act. They helped create the atmosphere of a crisis, There was a very interesting comment, I think, by one of the, in 2012, by a head of, I think it was a head of Rio Tinto in London, said, look, if you're thinking about putting a resources tax on any of our mining companies, any government around the world, take a look what happened in Australia and think again. They certainly chimed in on it. They were that blatant. They were that blatant. You shouldn't take the lessons from Australia. But this was the main question. It was not because it was too left-wing. It was because of the vital importance of the China question for the whole strategy of United States imperialism. And just one last point, we're going to see an intensification of the war drive against China under the Biden administration. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And so, and my second to last question is what can you say about the economic legacy and the assault on the working class of Julia Gillard's successor, Tony Abbott, and the current Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, and of course the current Liberal Prime Minister Scott Morrison? Well,
again, the decline in living standards for the working class is a product of the policies of the Labourites. Abbott tried to introduce a budget in 2014, which, deepened those attacks. By and large, I mean, he wasn't able to succeed. I I mean, the attacks are essentially carried out by the Labor Party through the states, among other places. You know, the whole consensus really is the Labor Party agenda. I mean, Abbott lost his position. When was he out? 2014. He's gone by 2015. Turnbull comes in. You know, Turnbull didn't do much in terms of, you know, they do marginal changes. But now let's take a look at what's happening now. Depends upon the labour rights. The major change we've seen is a result of COVID-19. Now, what happened? As soon as COVID strikes, where does the government go to? They formed a collaboration with the ACTU. This was fixed up through Greg Combay, through others, the Industrial Relations Minister Christian Porter, through Greg Combay, was put in touch with the head of the ACTU, Sally McManus, and they agreed, under the so-called emergency of COVID, for sweeping attacks on workers' conditions. And Sally McManus said, look, you don't have to come with a bludgeon. You don't have to come with a big, you know, piece of wood and bash us over the head. Cooperate. She said this. Cooperate with the unions and we can get it done. We will do it for you. We will make changes in award conditions. We will make changes in working conditions. And Christian Porter, the Industrial Relations Minister and the Attorney General, described, Sally McManus, the head of the trade unions, as his BFF, best friend forever. So again,
so this is the union leadership and the labor opposition actually working with Scott Morrison,
exactly,
and the reactionary Liberal Party.
That's
to
right,
say that
working, and they set up what's called a national cabinet, right, which involved the state governments and the federal government. State governments, some of which are controlled by Labor. I think there's 3 controlled by Labor, 3 by the Liberals and the federal government. But most importantly, that was important, and it's a very, what authority this national cabinet really has is open to question. It's not a constitutional body, so you have a move in that direction to establish some kind of mechanism of rule which is outside of Parliament doesn't meet, but this thing decides what's going on. But the most important aspect was the negotiations with the trade unions to do away with penalty rates, with other conditions, to introduce short-time working. In other words, to the next stage of development they want is, above all, the type of gig economy which is developing all around the world. Short-term contracts. You can be called in. No, we don't want you today. That's what capital wants. And under the pretext of, the emergency COVID measures, we've got to cut this away, that's what they want to do. And we have a thing called penalty rates in Australia, where if you work if you work more than 8 hours, then you get paid time and a half. Or if you work Sundays, you get paid time and a half, or perhaps double time, or so on. And a lot of people depend on those higher rates because the base rate is so low, they have to go and work, and they want to eliminate that. And more, and we're seeing this all over, I'm sure we're seeing it in Europe, the sort of gig economy, 0 hours contracts, you come in when I call you, when I don't want you, you don't come in. That's what they're moving towards, and that's what this collaboration and discussion with Sally McManus and the trade unions was about. And the unions said, you don't have to come, as I said, with a big stick and beat us around the head. We're ready to give you what you want. And that's what they've been doing. To such an extent, you have this, collaboration that's taking place between the government and the trade union leadership. Again, why? Because what the union bureaucracies fear above all is a movement from below of the working class. That's been central to what they've been doing over the last 50 years, 40, 50 years really, since the Canberra coup. As Hawke put it very well, the unleashing of forces the like of which we've never seen. And the objective conditions for the unleashing of those forces are here. COVID, the attacks on workers' conditions. There's an enormous, class tension building up in Australia and everywhere.
And two final questions, because we actually sort of covered everything then. So this second to last question is, given given that there's no difference between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, and there's
that's not exactly true. There are differences, right? There are differences. They have different ways.
To explain.
Well, they serve different social interests. I mean, it's like the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. Yes, they're both parties of Wall Street, okay? Australian, both Liberal and Labor, are parties of the capitalist class. But they have different tactical differences that emerge, So it's not all, and you've got to follow those differences to understand what's going on.
Okay.
And one of the concerns in the ruling circles at the moment is that the Labor Party is so discredited in the eyes of workers that come a big explosion, they're not going to be able to contain it. They're trying to drum. So there are differences. They serve different functions, within Australian politics, as different parties serve different political functions for the same class ends, but they do have different tactical. Anyway, so just the point you were going to make was.
Yeah. So given that because the way you describe the Australian working class is that the Australian working class is very conscious that the Labour Party and the Liberal Party are two rival oligarchic parties, and some of their allies in local government. So all that being said, why why hasn't there been a revolt against this kind of two-party duopoly, and an alternative left party like, say, the Green Party hasn't been able to make big waves?
Well, you used the word conscious, right? So the working class is conscious. That's not exactly the situation.
Okay.
If the working class were conscious of the political mechanisms that operate, then the class struggle would be far more advanced. What there is though, and this is very important, and it's the basis for the development of consciousness, is an elemental hostility to the existing party system. I mean, workers will say to you, right? Look, when I put it this way, when I was growing up, when I was a young man, not so long ago, but when I was a young man, when I was your age, people would say to me, and I came forward in politics in the era of the Vietnam War and began my political life in protesting against that war and so on. But people would say to me, "Look, I'm a Hawke man, or I'm a Whitlam man, or I was at that stage a follower for a brief period of Jim Cairns, who was a leader in the Labor Party, when I was 20 or 18 or 19. I mean, there were people you followed, or you would say, I'm a Labor person. People would say, workers would say that. And that was a problem to break them from the Labor. But there was a certain identification. No one would say today, what's his, I'm an Anthony Albanese man. I mean, it's just, it's a joke. I mean, so there's an elemental hostility, but that's not yet political consciousness. That's not yet really an understanding. And of course, what that understanding means is, and what consciousness involves, is understanding that a break has got to be made from the whole political apparatus, and the working class has got to start building its own revolutionary party on a very different program. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. There are all kinds of searches for alternatives. I mean, some people, vote in elections for the Greens, but they're no different. They collaborated with the Labor government of Gillard. All the industrial relations laws that are on the books that are used against workers were delivered with the sanction of the Greens.
Okay.
They supported all the so-called anti-terror laws. And Australia has some of the worst in the world, and they've introduced, in fact, in this country, more so-called anti-terror laws which attack democratic rights than possibly any other countries. The Greens voted for all of them. They're not. So there have been experiments, and there's been movements to the right as well. Disaffected sections of the middle classes, disaffected rural areas, disaffected sections of workers have voted for right-wing parties such as One Nation, which is Pauline Hanson's extreme right-wing party. There's all kinds of... So it all sort of expresses this hostility to the political establishment. I mean, both parties, Liberal and Labor, their overall vote in elections is Labor Party went down to 33%. Liberal Party is not a hell of a lot better, 37% in the last. There's some 30% of the electorate didn't vote for either of them. And those who do vote for out of habit, conservatism. There's no positive support for either party. But as yet, there's not the development of political consciousness and understanding. And that's what we're fighting for in the World Socialist website, the WSWS, the SEP, fighting to develop that. But there's a lot of rubbish to remove to do that.
And is the SCP exactly? And is the SCP now is the state of your party do you run in electoral politics or is the party not there yet? Like the Socialist Equality Group, your sister party in New Zealand.
No, we certainly run. We're a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. We haven't yet established a section in New Zealand, but we have supporters there, Socialist Equality Group. But we're a registered political party. We appear on the electoral ballot. Our name appears. You have to have members to be able to do that. They're certified by the Electoral Office, and we stand in our name and we put our name on the ballot. We don't get at this stage huge numbers of votes, but the votes we do get are very conscious votes given to us, by workers, by youth, by other people, middle-class people, some who vote for a socialist program. And so certainly, yes, we're on the ballot. But we don't see the change, coming through electoral politics. The changes that they'll take. We certainly try and use the election process to get our message out. We're heavily censored by the media. We're never invited to... I mean, you can have right-wing fascist supporters, groups, right, which have a handful of members, a handful. They're heavily promoted at certain times on the ABC, the national broadcaster, other papers, and so on. They're heavily... Is there an interview with the SEP General Secretary or, on election policy? Never. As a D notice.
Wow.
Not because we're unpopular, but because they fear that our policies will strike a chord. People are looking for an alternative. And so we don't get publicity. We don't get it from the ABC, the national broadcaster. We don't have a broadcast. We're not, they'll tell you. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, Oh, we don't interview because you're too small. Well, you don't give us the opportunity to put out our position so we can grow bigger, I mean, part of the function of elections is not just who's going to get on and the same process happens in America, is not just who's going to get elected and so on, but also the opportunity for parties to make their voices heard and give the electorate a choice. It's one of the functions of it. Anyway, so yes, we stand and we put candidates forward, as many as we can, and the resources will allow, in order to get our message across to broader sections of workers and youth. And we take that opportunity because in elections there is a heightened interest in politics, and we seek to utilise that.
Well, and the last question, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about another fellow Australian of yours who's a political prisoner in Belmarsh prison in Britain, Julian Assange. And the World Socialist website has been one of the few news outlets, as well as an organization that has campaigned for justice in freeing Julian Assange. Not once have you guys ever thrown him under the bus, unlike other pseudo left outlets, and there's also this, and there's also people who tend to smear him before they defend him. So I have to ask, do you know what's the update on the situation regarding Julian Assange? I know he won't be extradited to the United States, but what's the latest in his condition?
I'm not exactly familiar with all of the details of that. I know the United States was appealing the question of non-extradition. I mean, it's outrageous. It's a complete travesty. But yes, we have played a very prominent role. I mean, we held one of the first demonstrations in the world in June 2018, demanding the freedom of Julian Assange. And it is striking, as you say, striking, that all the pseudo-lefts, all of them, and you see here the pernicious role of identity politics, immediately, and Julian Assange warned of this, in 2010 when he released these documents, he said the American state is going to come after and get me. And one of the things they always do is try and fit you up on a sex scandal. I mean, it's so all of the pseudo-left jumped into line on this. Yeah. Oh, and you see the role of identity politics here, to whip up an atmosphere against him, to poison the whole atmosphere against him, and to, as you say, throw him under the bus. That was the issue. And we opposed this, and we said this is but you see the class character of these organisations. The imperialists cracked the whip and they jumped into line. And that demonstrates their politics on every question. We've remained absolutely clear. This is a fundamental issue for workers. And we've insisted that the only way in which Assange is going to be freed is not appeals to Donald Trump or to anyone else to grant him a pardon. There's got to be a mass movement in the working class, because this concerns every worker. This concerns the democratic rights of every working person in the world. If they can do this to him, then of course it's open slather for attack. So it's we believe a fundamental political issue, and we'll continue to fight on that line, and we bring this forward at every opportunity that we can.
All right. Well, on that note, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 by Nick Beams, who is a member of the Socialist Equality Party's branch in Australia and a contributor to the World Socialist website. Nick, I'm going to have to invite you back on again so that we can discuss more things Australian history and get deeper into the economic legacies of Keating, Rudd, Gillard, Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison, but we'll save that for another time. So Nick, thank you so much for joining us today on 1+1. I look forward to having you or any of your comrades back on the program, and best of luck with your campaign. And I do hope that the SCP will grow and grow in Australia.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on, Youri, and thank you to your audience. I hope they'll learn something from my remarks.
Likewise.
Thank you.